You know what's wild? The craziest conspiracy theories aren't theories at all. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about government programs so disturbing, so unbelievable, that if I told you they were real without proof, you'd call me a conspiracy theorist. But here's the thing. Every single program I'm about to share with you has been declassified, documented and confirmed by the United States government itself. We're talking about mind control experiments on unwitting citizens, secret programs to fake terrorist attacks on American soil, biological warfare tests conducted on entire cities, government agencies spying on civil rights leaders, and operations so bizarre they sound like science fiction, but they're not fiction, they're history. Over the next 2 hours, I'm going to walk you through 10 of the most shocking secret government programs that actually happened. Programs that were hidden from the American people for decades. Programs that, when finally revealed, changed how we think about government secrecy forever. I've spent weeks researching declassified documents, congressional testimony, and verified historical records. Everything I'm about to tell you is documented fact. No speculation, no theories, just the disturbing truth about what your government has done in secret. And I need to warn you, some of these stories are deeply unsettling. We're going to talk about human experimentation, psychological torture, and government operations that violated every ethical principle we claim to hold dear. But I think you need to hear this, because the only way to prevent these abuses from happening again is to remember that they happened in the first place. So get comfortable, maybe grab some tea or coffee, turn off the lights if you want that full immersive experience. Because what you're about to hear isn't a bedtime story, it's a wake-up call. Before we dive in, let me address something. You might be thinking, why should I care about old government programs? That was decades ago. Things are different now. But here's the thing. These programs weren't ancient history when they were exposed. MKUltra ran until 1973. COINTELPRO ended in 1971. The Tuskegee study continued until 1972. These aren't stories from some distant past. These are things that happened during many of your parents' lifetimes. Some of you watching might have been alive when these programs were still running. And more importantly, the mindset that created these programs. The belief that the government can do whatever it wants in the name of national security. That secrecy justifies any action. That the ends always justify the means. That mindset didn't disappear when these programs were exposed. In fact, as we'll see when we get to the more recent programs, that mindset is alive and well today. So this isn't just a history lesson. This is about understanding how power works, how secrecy enables abuse, and why we need to constantly question what our government does in our name. Now, I'm going to present these 10 programs in roughly chronological order, starting with the 1950s and moving forward to programs that were active just a few years ago. Each program reveals something different about government secrecy, different methods, different justifications, different victims, but they all share one thing in common. They were all hidden from the American people. In most cases, they were hidden from Congress. In some cases, they were even hidden from the presidents who were supposedly in charge. These programs only came to light because of whistleblowers, investigative journalists, congressional investigations, or sheer accidents. And that raises a disturbing question. How many programs are still secret? How many operations are happening right now that we won't learn about for another 30, 40, or 50 years? We'll come back to that question at the end. But for now, let's start our journey into the dark side of government secrecy. We're going to begin with perhaps the most infamous secret program in American history. A program so disturbing that when it was finally exposed, it became the template for every conspiracy theory about government mind control that followed. This program involved drugging unwitting citizens, conducting brutal psychological experiments, and destroying people's minds in the name of fighting communism. The CIA ran it for 20 years, spending millions of dollars and involving dozens of universities, hospitals, and prisons. And when they were about to get caught, they destroyed the evidence. This is the story of MKUltra. But before we get into the details, I want you to understand the context. It's 1953. World War II ended just 8 years ago. The Cold War is heating up. The Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. China has fallen to communism. The Korean War just ended and American prisoners of war are coming home with strange stories. Some of these POWs seem different. They're speaking positively about communism. Some refuse to come home, choosing to stay in North Korea or China. American intelligence agencies are convinced that the communists have developed advanced brainwashing techniques. There are reports of Soviet and Chinese scientists conducting mind control experiments, reports of drugs that can make people reveal secrets, reports of psychological techniques that can break down a person's identity and rebuild it from scratch. The CIA is terrified. If the enemy has mind control capabilities and America doesn't, we could lose the Cold War without firing a single shot. Imagine if communist agents could brainwash American leaders, turn our spies into double agents or program assassins to kill on command. This fear, this paranoia, is what led to MKUltra. The CIA decided that if the communists were developing mind control, America needed to develop it too, and they needed to do it fast, in secret, and without any ethical constraints. So in April 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized a program that would become one of the darkest chapters in American intelligence history. The program was given the codename MKUltra. The MK stood for the CIA's Technical Services Staff. Ultra was a classification level above top secret. Even the name was designed to keep people away. If you saw MKUltra on a document and didn't have the proper clearance, you weren't supposed to ask questions. The man put in charge was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who would later be called the Black Sorcerer of the CIA. Gottlieb was a fascinating character. He had a club foot, a stutter, and a passion for folk dancing. He grew Christmas trees on his farm and was known for his gentle demeanor. He also had absolutely no moral qualms about experimenting on human beings without their knowledge or consent. Under Gottlieb's direction, MKUltra would grow into a sprawling network of 149 sub-projects involving at least 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The CIA funneled money through front organizations with innocent-sounding names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Many of these institutions had no idea they were working for the CIA. Professors thought they were doing legitimate research funded by private foundations. Doctors thought they were conducting cutting-edge psychiatric treatments. They had no idea they were part of a secret mind control program, and the experiments they conducted were beyond anything you can imagine. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. MKUltra, the CIA's mind control experiments. So what exactly did MKUltra do? What does a mind control program actually look like? The answer is more disturbing than you can imagine. MKUltra tested hundreds of methods for manipulating human consciousness and behavior. They experimented with hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and various forms of torture. They tested electroshock therapy at levels far beyond what was considered safe. They tried to erase memories and implant false ones. But the centerpiece of MKUltra was drugs, specifically LSD. LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, had been discovered in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. He was working with compounds derived from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. In 1943, Hofmann accidentally absorbed some LSD through his skin and experienced the first acid trip in history. By the 1950s, the CIA became obsessed with LSD's potential. The drug caused profound alterations in consciousness, perception, and thought. People on LSD experienced hallucinations, lost their sense of time and space, and sometimes couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. To the CIA, this sounded perfect for mind control. Could LSD be used to make enemy agents reveal secrets? Could it be used to program assassins? Could it break down a person's identity and rebuild it from scratch? Could it be slipped into a Soviet diplomat's drink before an important negotiation? There was only one way to find out. Test it on people. And that's exactly what they did. CIA agents began dosing people with LSD, often without their knowledge or consent. They would slip it into drinks at parties and observe the results. They dosed each other as pranks in the office. They hired prostitutes to lure men to CIA safe houses, where the men would be drugged and filmed through two-way mirrors while having sex. That particular operation was called Midnight Climax, and we'll come back to it later because it deserves its own discussion. But the experiments went far beyond just giving people LSD and watching what happened. The CIA wanted to know if they could use drugs to completely destroy and rebuild human personality. This is where things get truly dark. At McGill University in Montreal, Canada, a Scottish-born psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron conducted some of the most brutal MKUltra experiments. Cameron was a respected figure in psychiatry. He had been president of the American Psychiatric Association, president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and president of the World Psychiatric Association. He was also a monster. Cameron believed he could cure mental illness by erasing a person's mind and rebuilding it from scratch. He called this process psychic driving. His theory was that if you could reduce a patient to an infant-like state, wiping out their memories, their personality, their sense of self, you could then reprogram them to be mentally healthy. It was pseudoscience, it was torture, and the CIA funded it. Cameron's patients, many of whom had checked into his clinic for minor issues like postpartum depression, anxiety, or marital problems, were subjected to horrific treatments. First, Cameron would put them into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time. He used combinations of barbiturates and other sedatives to keep patients unconscious for days or weeks. Some patients were kept in a coma for up to 88 days straight. While they were unconscious, Cameron would administer massive electroshock treatments. Normal electroshock therapy at the time used about 110 volts. Cameron used 30 to 40 times the normal power. He called this depatterning. The idea was to completely wipe out existing brain patterns. Then came the psychic driving phase. Patients would be placed in isolation, sometimes with their eyes taped shut or covered with goggles, their ears covered with headphones. Through the headphones, they would hear recorded messages played on a loop, the same message over and over, for 16 to 20 hours a day, sometimes for weeks or months. The messages were things like, "You are a good wife and mother," or "You have confidence in yourself." Cameron believed that by repeating these messages thousands of times, he could reprogram the patient's mind. It didn't work. It just destroyed people. One of Cameron's patients was a woman named Val Orlikow. She was the wife of a Canadian Member of Parliament. She checked into Cameron's clinic in 1956, suffering from postpartum depression after the birth of her 5th child. Cameron put her through his full treatment protocol: drug-induced comas, massive electroshock, weeks of isolation with recorded messages playing in her ears. When Val Orlikow finally left the clinic, she couldn't recognize her husband or her children. She had to relearn how to use a toilet. She had to relearn how to eat with utensils. Her memory had been completely destroyed. She never fully recovered. And she had no idea that her treatment had been funded by the CIA as part of a mind control experiment. Cameron treated dozens of patients this way. Their lives were destroyed. Some never recovered their memories. Some were left with permanent brain damage. Some committed suicide. And Cameron's work was just one sub-project of MKUltra. There were 148 others. At the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky, the CIA funded experiments on inmates. The researcher, Dr. Harris Isbell, would offer prisoners reduced sentences or drugs in exchange for participating in experiments. Many of these prisoners were black men serving time for drug offenses. They were desperate for any chance to reduce their sentences or get access to drugs to feed their addictions, so they volunteered. Isbell would give them LSD and other drugs, then observe the effects. In some experiments, prisoners were kept on LSD for 77 consecutive days. 77 days of being high on acid, with no break, no relief, no escape. Can you imagine what that does to a person's mind? The CIA also experimented on people who couldn't consent at all. They funded experiments on children with developmental disabilities. They tested drugs on terminal cancer patients without telling them what they were being given. They dosed mental patients who were already vulnerable and confused. In one experiment at a hospital in New York, the CIA funded research where mentally disabled children were fed radioactive oatmeal to study how radiation moved through the body. The children's parents were told it was a nutrition study. They had no idea their children were being used as test subjects for radiation experiments. The CIA also conducted experiments on its own employees. But unlike the unwitting subjects, these were supposed to be voluntary, except they weren't always voluntary. CIA agents would dose each other with LSD as pranks. They'd slip it into someone's coffee at the office and then watch them trip. They thought it was funny. They called it behavior modification. But for some people, it wasn't funny at all. In November 1953, a CIA employee named Frank Olson attended a retreat with his colleagues at a cabin in rural Maryland. On the second night, Sidney Gottlieb, the head of MKUltra, spiked the after-dinner drinks with LSD. Olson and several other men were dosed without their knowledge. After about 20 minutes, Gottlieb told them what he'd done. Most of the men laughed it off, but Olson had a bad reaction. He became paranoid and agitated. He thought people were trying to kill him. He couldn't sleep. His colleagues tried to calm him down, but he kept getting worse. A week later, Olson was in New York City, supposedly being taken to see a doctor. He was staying at the Statler Hotel with a CIA colleague who was supposed to watch him. In the early morning hours of November 28, 1953, Frank Olson crashed through the window of his 13th floor hotel room and fell to his death. The CIA ruled it a suicide. They told Olson's family that he had been depressed and jumped. They didn't mention the LSD. They didn't mention MKUltra. They classified the whole incident and moved on. For 22 years, the Olson family believed Frank had committed suicide due to mental illness. They had no idea he'd been drugged by his own colleagues as part of a secret CIA experiment. The truth only came out in 1975, when MKUltra was finally exposed, and that exposure almost didn't happen. In 1973, the CIA got word that MKUltra was about to be exposed. Journalists were asking questions, congressional investigators were getting suspicious. The program had been running for 20 years and the secret was starting to leak. So CIA Director Richard Helms made a decision. He ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the program, personally oversaw the destruction. Thousands of documents were shredded or burned. Research files, experimental results, lists of test subjects, financial records, all of it was supposed to disappear forever, and it almost worked. The CIA thought they had successfully buried MKUltra. They thought the secret would die with them, but they made one mistake. Some financial records had been misfiled. Instead of being stored with the MKUltra files, they'd been filed with routine financial documents. When Helms ordered the destruction of MKUltra files, these misfiled boxes were overlooked. They survived. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published an article in the New York Times revealing that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic surveillance operations. This sparked outrage and led to congressional investigations. In 1975, Senator Frank Church led a committee to investigate intelligence abuses. The Church Committee, as it became known, began digging into CIA operations, and that's when they found those misfiled boxes. The boxes contained financial records showing that the CIA had funded mind control experiments at universities, hospitals, and prisons across the country. The records didn't contain details of the experiments; those had been destroyed. But they provided enough evidence to prove the program existed. The Church Committee held public hearings. CIA Director William Colby was forced to testify. He admitted that MKUltra had existed and that the CIA had conducted experiments on unwitting American citizens. But he claimed that most of the records had been destroyed, so the full extent of the program would never be known. Sidney Gottlieb was called to testify. He was retired by then, living on his farm, growing Christmas trees. He showed up to the hearing and admitted his role in MKUltra, but he showed no remorse. He defended the program as necessary for national security. He said they were just trying to keep up with the Soviets. When asked about the people who had been harmed by the experiments, Gottlieb was dismissive. He said that some people had bad reactions, but that was the nature of research. He compared it to testing new medicines. Sometimes there are side effects, except these weren't volunteers in a clinical trial. These were unwitting victims who never consented to being experimented on. The Church Committee's report on MKUltra was damning. They concluded that the CIA had violated basic human rights, conducted illegal experiments, and operated with no meaningful oversight. They recommended reforms to prevent such abuses in the future. But here's what's infuriating. Nobody was prosecuted. Richard Helms, who ordered the destruction of evidence, was never charged. Sidney Gottlieb, who ran the program and destroyed people's lives, was never charged. The doctors who tortured patients, the agents who drugged unwitting citizens, none of them faced criminal charges. Some CIA officials received reprimands, some were transferred to different positions, but nobody went to jail. The victims of MKUltra did receive some compensation, but it was inadequate. In 1976, President Gerald Ford formally apologized to Frank Olson's family and gave them $750,000. In the 1980s, several of Dr. Cameron's victims sued the CIA and received settlements, but the amounts were small, and many victims received nothing. Val Orlikow, the woman whose memory was destroyed, received $100,000 in a settlement that was supposed to compensate her for a lifetime of brain damage and lost memories. The full extent of MKUltra will never be known because the files were destroyed. We only know about the experiments that were documented in those misfiled financial records, or that came to light through victim testimony. How many other people were experimented on? How many other lives were destroyed? We'll never know. And here's the most disturbing question. Did MKUltra actually end in 1973, or did it just go deeper underground? The CIA claims the program was terminated, but they also claimed it didn't exist at all until they were forced to admit it. Why should we believe them now? In the 1980s and 1990s, there were reports of similar experiments continuing under different names. Victims came forward claiming they had been subjected to mind control experiments. The CIA denied everything. Maybe these people were delusional, or maybe they were telling the truth and we just don't have the documents to prove it yet. MKUltra proved something terrifying. The US government is willing to experiment on its own citizens without consent, without oversight, and without accountability. And when caught, they'll destroy the evidence and face no consequences. It proved that the craziest conspiracy theories about government mind control aren't crazy at all. They're based on documented fact, and it proved that secrecy enables evil. MKUltra only happened because it was secret. If the program had been public, if there had been oversight, if journalists and citizens had known what was happening, it would have been stopped immediately. But it wasn't public. It was hidden behind classification levels and code names and front organizations, and that secrecy allowed it to continue for 20 years. MKUltra targeted individuals, specific test subjects in specific locations. But our next program was even more ambitious. It targeted entire movements, entire communities, entire ideologies. While the CIA was experimenting with mind control, the FBI was waging a secret war against American citizens who dared to challenge the status quo. This program didn't just spy on people, it actively worked to destroy their lives, break up their organizations, and silence their voices. It was called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, and it turned the FBI into a domestic secret police force that targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and anyone else J. Edgar Hoover considered a threat. Chapter 2. COINTELPRO, the FBI's war on dissent on March 8, 1971, while America was distracted by the Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier boxing match, the fight of the century. 8 activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They weren't professional burglars, they were ordinary citizens, a professor, a cab driver, a social worker, a daycare center director. They called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. They picked the lock, walked into the office and spent hours going through filing cabinets. They took every document they could carry, more than 1,000 files. Then they disappeared into the night. A few days later, newspapers across the country received manila envelopes containing photocopies of FBI documents. Most of the documents seemed routine. Background checks, administrative memos, nothing too exciting. But one document was different. It was a routing slip with a single word stamped on it: COINTELPRO. Nobody knew what COINTELPRO meant. The journalists who received the documents had never heard of it. They started asking questions. The FBI refused to comment. They launched a massive investigation to find the burglars, but the Citizens Commission had covered their tracks well. The FBI never caught them, and slowly, as journalists dug deeper and more documents leaked out, the truth about COINTELPRO began to emerge. It was one of the most extensive domestic surveillance and disruption programs in American history, and its mission wasn't to catch criminals or stop foreign spies. Its mission was to disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize American citizens engaged in political activism. Let me say that again, because it's important. The FBI had a program specifically designed to destroy the lives of Americans exercising their constitutional rights to free speech and assembly. COINTELPRO began in 1956, during the height of the Red Scare. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was obsessed with communism. He saw communist infiltrators everywhere, in Hollywood, in universities, in labor unions, in civil rights organizations. Hoover believed that the Communist Party USA was a threat to national security, and he was probably right about that. The Communist Party did have ties to the Soviet Union, and this was the Cold War. So the FBI launched COINTELPRO to infiltrate and disrupt the Communist Party. They planted informants, spread false rumors, and worked to create internal conflicts within the party. If the program had stopped there, it might have been defensible, but it didn't stop there, not even close. Over the next 15 years, COINTELPRO expanded to target civil rights groups, anti-war activists, feminist organizations, Native American activists, and anyone else Hoover deemed a threat to the social order. By the time it ended in 1971, COINTELPRO had conducted operations against thousands of American citizens and hundreds of organizations. The targets included some of the most important figures in American history, and the tactics they used were absolutely ruthless. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of J. Edgar Hoover's primary targets, and the FBI's campaign against him was absolutely vicious. Hoover hated King. He thought King was a communist, a fraud, and a threat to America. There's no evidence that King was actually a communist. He wasn't, but some of King's advisors had past connections to the Communist Party, and that was enough for Hoover. Starting in 1963, the FBI put King under constant surveillance. They tapped his phones at home and at his office. They bugged his hotel rooms wherever he traveled. They followed him everywhere. They were listening to his private conversations, recording his intimate moments, documenting every detail of his life. The FBI wasn't just gathering intelligence. They were looking for dirt. They wanted something they could use to destroy King's reputation and credibility, and they found it. The surveillance revealed that King had extramarital affairs. For Hoover, this was gold. He could use this to discredit King, to undermine the civil rights movement, to prove that King was a hypocrite and a fraud. In 1964, the FBI took their campaign to a new level. They compiled audio recordings of King's extramarital encounters and created a tape. Then they sent the tape to King's home, along with an anonymous letter. The letter was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was written to look like it came from a disillusioned black supporter. It called King a fraud and a hypocrite. It said his secrets would soon be exposed to the world, and then it suggested that King should kill himself. The letter read, in part, "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." This wasn't law enforcement. This was a government agency trying to drive a civil rights leader to suicide. King received the package about a month before he was scheduled to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. The 34 days mentioned in the letter would have put the deadline right before the ceremony. The FBI was trying to get King to kill himself before he could accept the Nobel Prize. King didn't kill himself, obviously, but the letter deeply disturbed him. He and his advisors knew it came from the FBI. They knew they were being targeted by their own government. The FBI's campaign against King continued until his assassination in 1968, and even after his death, the FBI continued to surveil and harass his associates. But King wasn't the only target. COINTELPRO went after the entire civil rights movement. The FBI infiltrated civil rights organizations with informants. They spread false rumors to create internal conflicts. They sent fake letters to create distrust between leaders. They worked with local police to harass activists with bogus arrests. The Black Panther Party was targeted with particular intensity. The Panthers were a revolutionary black nationalist organization founded in 1966. They advocated for armed self-defense, community programs, and radical political change. Hoover called the Black Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. He made destroying them a top priority. The FBI infiltrated the Panthers with informants at every level. They spread false information to create paranoia within the organization. They sent fake letters to incite violence between the Panthers and rival groups. One FBI operation involved sending a fake letter to a gang leader in Los Angeles, claiming that the Panthers had put out a hit on him. The letter was designed to start a war between the gang and the Panthers. It worked. The resulting violence left several people dead. In Chicago, the FBI's campaign against the Panthers culminated in one of the most controversial incidents of the era. Fred Hampton was the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. He was 21 years old, charismatic, and an incredibly effective organizer. He was building coalitions between the Panthers and other groups, including white working-class organizations. He was becoming too powerful, too influential. The FBI decided he had to be stopped. The FBI had an informant inside Hampton's inner circle, a man named William O'Neill. O'Neill provided the FBI with detailed information about Hampton's apartment, including a floor plan showing exactly where Hampton slept. On December 3rd, 1969, O'Neill drugged Hampton's drink with a powerful sedative. That night, Hampton went to bed heavily drugged. In the early morning hours of December 4th, Chicago police raided Hampton's apartment. They claimed they were serving a search warrant for illegal weapons. But what happened next was clearly not a normal police raid. The police opened fire immediately, shooting through the walls and doors. Hampton's girlfriend, who was sleeping next to him, tried to wake him up, but Hampton was so heavily drugged that he couldn't wake up. The police burst into the bedroom and shot Hampton twice in the head at point-blank range. He was killed in his bed. Another Panther, Mark Clark, was also killed. Several others were wounded. The police claimed it was a shootout, that the Panthers had fired first, but the evidence told a different story. Forensic analysis showed that the police had fired between 82 and 99 shots. The Panthers had fired exactly one shot, and that was likely an involuntary reflex when Mark Clark was hit. This wasn't a shootout, it was an assassination. Later investigations revealed the FBI's role in the raid. They had provided the floor plan. Their informant had drugged Hampton. They had coordinated with local police. They had set up the entire operation. In 1982, after years of legal battles, the families of Hampton and Clark won a settlement of $185 million from the federal government and the city of Chicago. The government never admitted wrongdoing, but the settlement was essentially an admission that the raid had been unjustified. William O'Neill, the FBI informant who drugged Hampton, lived with the guilt for decades. In 1990, he committed suicide by running into traffic on a highway. The FBI's war on the Black Panthers destroyed the organization. By the mid-1970s, the Panthers were effectively finished, not because they had been defeated in any ideological battle, but because the FBI had systematically dismantled them from within. But COINTELPRO didn't just target black activists. The program also went after anti-war groups. particularly those opposing the Vietnam War. The FBI infiltrated student organizations, peace groups, and anti-draft movements. They used the same tactics they used against civil rights groups, spreading rumors, creating paranoia, inciting violence. One particularly cruel tactic was called bad jacketing, spreading false information to make genuine activists appear to be FBI informants. The FBI would plant evidence or spread rumors that a particular activist was working for the government. This was devastatingly effective. Activist organizations became paranoid and distrustful. They spent more time investigating each other than organizing against the war. In some cases, activists who were falsely accused of being informants were beaten or killed by their own movements. The FBI also targeted the American Indian movement, which was fighting for Native American rights and sovereignty. They targeted feminist organizations. They even targeted religious groups. The Quakers, a pacifist religious denomination, were surveilled because they opposed the Vietnam War. Think about that. The FBI was spying on Quakers, pacifist Quakers who wouldn't hurt a fly. But they opposed the war, so Hoover considered them a threat. By 1971, COINTELPRO had conducted operations against 2,070 organizations and individuals. The program had destroyed lives, broken up families, incited violence, and undermined constitutional rights on a massive scale. And it was all done in secret, with no oversight, no accountability, and no legal authority. COINTELPRO officially ended in 1971 after the media, Pennsylvania break-in, exposed the program. Once the documents became public, the FBI couldn't continue the program under the same name. But did the tactics really end, or did they just get rebranded? In 1975, the Church Committee investigated COINTELPRO and issued a scathing report. They concluded that the program was a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at preventing the exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association. The committee found that COINTELPRO had violated the constitutional rights of thousands of Americans. They recommended reforms and new oversight mechanisms. But here's the thing, nobody was prosecuted. J. Edgar Hoover had died in 1972, so he never faced justice. The FBI agents who sent that letter to Dr. King, who facilitated Fred Hampton's assassination, who destroyed countless lives, they all got away with it. Some received reprimands, a few were transferred, but nobody went to jail. The FBI issued apologies, they promised reforms. They said it would never happen again, but the question remains, did it really end? Chapter 3, Operation Northwoods, the false flag that almost happened. So far, we've talked about programs that actually happened. MKUltra and COINTELPRO were real operations that destroyed real lives. But now I want to tell you about something different. A program that was proposed, planned in detail and approved by the highest levels of the military, but never actually executed. This is the story of Operation Northwoods, and it might be the most disturbing program on this list because it shows just how far the government was willing to go. Operation Northwoods was a plan to stage terrorist attacks on American citizens and blame them on Cuba to justify a military invasion. Let me repeat that because it sounds like a conspiracy theory. The US military created detailed plans to commit acts of terrorism against Americans, kill American citizens and blame it on a foreign government to justify going to war. This isn't speculation. This isn't a theory. This is documented fact. The plans were written down, submitted to the president, and only rejected at the last minute. Here's how it happened. It's 1962. The Cold War is at its peak. Just a year earlier, the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba had failed spectacularly. Fidel Castro was still in power, and Cuba was becoming increasingly aligned with the Soviet Union. The US military and intelligence agencies were desperate to get rid of Castro. They saw Cuba as a communist threat just 90 miles from American shores. They wanted to invade, but they needed a justification, something that would rally public support and international approval. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, came up with a plan. The plan was developed by the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff under the leadership of Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer. It was codenamed Operation Northwoods. The documents were classified top secret and presented to President John F. Kennedy in March 1962. So what exactly did Operation Northwoods propose? The documents outlined a series of false flag operations, acts of terrorism that would be committed by the US government but blamed on Cuba. The goal was to create public outrage and international sympathy that would justify a US military invasion of Cuba. Let me read you some of the actual proposals from the declassified documents. These are direct quotes. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. Think about that. They were proposing to sink a boat full of Cuban refugees, real people fleeing communism, and blame it on Castro. The document continues. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized. They were proposing to shoot Cuban refugees on American soil to create outrage against Cuba, but it gets worse. Another proposal, exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement, also would be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government. They wanted to bomb American cities and frame Cuba for it. Another proposal involved hijacking planes. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. At a designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. The plan was to swap a passenger plane with a drone, blow up the drone over Cuba, and claim that Castro had shot down an American civilian aircraft full of innocent people. Does this sound familiar? It should. This is exactly the kind of false flag operation that conspiracy theorists talk about, except this one was real. It was actually planned by the US military. The Operation Northwoods documents included other proposals: stage a fake attack on the US naval base at Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba, create a Remember the Maine incident by blowing up an American ship in Cuban waters, stage fake Cuban attacks on other Caribbean nations to make Cuba look aggressive, create a fake communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami with bombings and violence, shoot down a drone aircraft and claim it was a civilian plane attacked by Cuban forces, fabricate evidence of Cuban aggression to present to the United Nations. Every detail was planned out. They had timelines, logistics, cover stories. This wasn't just brainstorming. This was a fully developed operational plan. The documents even discussed casualties. They acknowledged that some of these operations might result in American deaths, and they were okay with that. The deaths would be unfortunate but necessary to justify the invasion. Let me be clear about what this means. The highest-ranking military officers in the United States were proposing to murder American citizens to justify a war. The Operation Northwoods documents were presented to President Kennedy in March 1962. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously approved the plan. They were ready to move forward, but Kennedy said no. Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods. He was reportedly furious that such a plan had even been proposed. Shortly after rejecting Northwoods, Kennedy removed Lyman Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Lemnitzer wasn't fired. He was reassigned to be the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe. So even after proposing to kill Americans in a false flag operation, he still got a prestigious position. But at least he was removed from direct influence over US military policy. Operation Northwoods was shelved and classified. The documents were locked away and the plan was never executed. For decades, nobody knew about Operation Northwoods. It remained classified, buried in government archives. Then, in 1997, the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board declassified the Operation Northwoods documents as part of their investigation into Kennedy's assassination. When the documents became public, people were shocked. Here was proof that the US military had seriously considered staging terrorist attacks on Americans. Conspiracy theorists had been saying for years that the government might stage false flag attacks. They'd been dismissed as paranoid and crazy, but Operation Northwoods proved they weren't crazy. The government really had planned such operations. Now, it's important to note that Operation Northwoods was never executed. Kennedy rejected it, and there's no evidence that anything like it was ever carried out. But the fact that it was proposed, planned in detail, and approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff tells us something terrifying about how the military and intelligence agencies think. They were willing to kill Americans to achieve their geopolitical goals. They were willing to stage terrorist attacks on their own citizens. They were willing to lie to the public, to Congress, to the world. And the only thing that stopped them was one man, President Kennedy, saying no. What if Kennedy had said yes? What if a different president, more hawkish and more anti-Castro, had been in office? Would Operation Northwoods have been executed? And here's the really disturbing question. If they were willing to propose this in 1962, what other operations have been proposed since then? Operation Northwoods was only declassified by accident as part of the JFK assassination investigation. How many other plans like this exist in classified files that we'll never see? After 9/11, when conspiracy theorists suggested that the attacks might have been a false flag operation, they were dismissed as crazy. But Operation Northwoods proves that false flag operations aren't just theoretical. They're something the US government has actually planned. I'm not saying 9/11 was a false flag. There's no credible evidence for that, but Operation Northwoods shows that we can't dismiss the possibility out of hand just because it sounds crazy. The government has proven that it's capable of planning such operations. Operation Northwoods also raises questions about other historical events. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was used to justify escalating the Vietnam War, turned out to be largely fabricated. The second attack, the one that led to Congress authorizing military force, probably never happened. The government lied to justify a war. The Iraq War was justified based on claims that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Those claims turned out to be false. Whether it was an honest mistake or a deliberate lie is still debated, but the result was the same. We went to war based on false information. So when the government says we need to go to war, when they present evidence of threats and attacks, should we just trust them, or should we remember Operation Northwoods and ask hard questions? I'm not saying we should distrust everything the government says, but we should definitely verify. We should demand evidence. We should remember that the government has lied before and will lie again. Operation Northwoods didn't happen, but it almost did, and that's terrifying enough. Now let's talk about a program that did happen, one that's even more disturbing because of who it targeted and how long it lasted. Chapter 4, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. 40 years of medical racism. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began a medical study in Macon County, Alabama. The study would continue for 40 years, and in those 40 years, the government would watch hundreds of black men die from a completely curable disease, all in the name of science. This is the story of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, and it's one of the most shameful chapters in American medical history. The study began during the Great Depression. Syphilis was a major public health problem, particularly in poor rural communities. The disease progresses in stages, starting with sores, then a rash, then years of dormancy, and finally attacking the brain, heart, and other organs, leading to paralysis, dementia, and death. By the 1930s, there were treatments for syphilis, though they were toxic and not always effective. But researchers wanted to understand the natural progression of untreated syphilis, how the disease developed when left alone. So the U.S. Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute, recruited 600 black men from Macon County, Alabama. Of these, 399 had syphilis and 201 did not have the disease. They were the control group. The men were poor sharecroppers, most of them illiterate. They were told they were receiving free health care for bad blood. a local term that could mean anything from syphilis to anemia to fatigue. They were not told they had syphilis. They were not told they were part of an experiment. They were not told that they would be denied treatment. The researchers never intended to treat these men. The whole point of the study was to watch what happened when syphilis went untreated. They wanted to document the disease's progression from infection to death. In exchange for participating, the men received free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. For poor black men in Depression-era Alabama, this seemed like a good deal. They thought they were getting health care. They had no idea they were being used as human guinea pigs. The study was supposed to last 6 months. It lasted 40 years. In the early years of the study, the lack of treatment could be somewhat justified. The available treatments were toxic and not very effective. But in 1947, everything changed. Penicillin was discovered to be a safe and effective cure for syphilis. By the late 1940s, penicillin was widely available and had become the standard treatment for syphilis. This should have been the end of the study. The researchers had a cure. They could treat the men and end their suffering, but they didn't. Instead, the researchers actively prevented the men from receiving treatment. When the men tried to get treatment elsewhere, the researchers intervened to stop them. During World War II, when some of the men were called up for military service, the researchers pulled strings to keep them out of the draft, because the military would have tested them for syphilis and treated them. When public health programs came to Macon County offering free syphilis treatment, the researchers made sure the men in the study were excluded. The researchers were so committed to their study that they let men die rather than give them a simple shot of penicillin. Let me be clear about what this means. For 25 years after a cure was available, the US government watched black men suffer and die from syphilis. They didn't just fail to treat them, they actively prevented them from getting treatment. The men suffered horribly. Untreated syphilis causes devastating symptoms. Some went blind. Some went insane as the disease attacked their brains. Some developed heart disease. Some became paralyzed, and they died. By the time the study ended, 28 men had died directly from syphilis. 100 had died from complications related to syphilis. 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis. The researchers documented all of this. They wrote papers about the progression of the disease. They presented their findings at medical conferences. They built their careers on the suffering of these men, and nobody stopped them. The study wasn't secret. It was published in medical journals. Doctors and researchers knew about it. Nobody raised ethical concerns. Nobody questioned whether it was right to deny treatment to dying men. Why? Because the men were black, and this was the Jim Crow South. The Tuskegee study was built on racist assumptions. The researchers believed that black people experienced syphilis differently than white people. They believed that studying black men with syphilis would reveal something unique about the disease in black bodies. This was pseudoscience. Syphilis affects all humans the same way, regardless of race. But the racist ideology of the time treated black bodies as fundamentally different, as objects to be studied rather than people to be cared for. The study continued through the 1950s and 1960s. It continued through the civil rights movement. It continued as the country was supposedly moving toward racial equality, and it only ended because someone blew the whistle. In 1972, Peter Buxton, a public health service investigator, leaked information about the study to the press. Buxton had actually raised concerns about the study internally back in 1966, but he was ignored. So he went to the media. On July 25, 1972, the Washington Star published an article exposing the Tuskegee study. The next day, the New York Times ran the story on its front page. The public was outraged. How could the government do this? How could doctors watch men die when they had a cure? The outcry forced the government to act. On November 16, 1972, the Tuskegee study was officially terminated. 40 years after it began, an investigation was launched. The panel concluded that the study was ethically unjustified and that the men had been denied treatment for no good reason. But here's what's infuriating. The researchers defended their work. They argued that the study had produced valuable scientific data. They said that ending it prematurely would waste all the years of research. Some researchers argued that the men wouldn't have received treatment anyway, because they were poor and black, so the study didn't actually harm them. This was a lie. The researchers had actively prevented the men from receiving treatment that was freely available. The survivors of the study and the families of those who died filed a class action lawsuit. In 1974, the government settled for $10 million, about $37,000 per participant. That was supposed to compensate for 40 years of suffering and death. The settlement also provided free medical care for the survivors and their families. But by then, most of the men were dead. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized for the Tuskegee study. He invited 5 of the 8 remaining survivors to the White House. Clinton said, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens, to the survivors, to the wives and family members, the children and the grandchildren. I say what you know. No power on earth can give you back the lives lost, the pain suffered, the years of internal torment and anguish. What was done cannot be undone. But we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry." It was a powerful apology, but it came 25 years too late for most of the victims. The Tuskegee study had devastating consequences beyond the immediate victims. It created deep distrust of the medical establishment in the black community, a distrust that persists to this day. Even now, many black Americans are hesitant to participate in medical research or trust doctors because they remember Tuskegee. They remember that the government used black bodies for experiments. They remember that doctors let black men die. This distrust has real public health consequences. It affects vaccination rates, clinical trial participation, and healthcare utilization in black communities. During the COVID-19 pandemic, public health officials struggled to convince black Americans to get vaccinated. One of the major reasons was Tuskegee. People would say, "How do we know this isn't another Tuskegee?" That's the legacy of the Tuskegee study, generations of distrust that continues to harm public health. The study also led to major reforms in medical ethics. Before Tuskegee, there were few regulations governing human experimentation. Researchers had enormous freedom to do whatever they wanted. After Tuskegee, Congress passed the National Research Act of 1974. Which created institutional review boards to oversee human experimentation. The Act established requirements for informed consent. Participants must be told what the study involves and must voluntarily agree to participate. These reforms were necessary and important, but they only happened because the Tuskegee study was exposed. How many other unethical experiments happened that we don't know about? The Tuskegee study proves something terrifying. The government is willing to sacrifice the lives of vulnerable people in the name of science. And it's willing to do it for decades, even after a cure is available. It proves that racism enables atrocity. The study only happened because the victims were black men in the Jim Crow South. If they had been white men, the study would never have been approved. And it proves that institutions can normalize evil. For 40 years, doctors and researchers participated in this study. They saw the suffering. They knew a cure existed. But they continued anyway because the study had become routine, because nobody questioned it, because the victims were seen as less than human. The programs we've discussed so far, MKUltra, COINTELPRO, Operation Northwoods, Tuskegee, all happened during the Cold War, when fear of communism was used to justify almost anything. But our next program shows that the Cold War paranoia led to something even more disturbing, bringing Nazi war criminals to America and giving them jobs. Chapter 5, Operation Paperclip, Recruiting Nazi Scientists. In 1945, World War II ended. The Nazis were defeated. The world learned about the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. The Nuremberg trials were held to prosecute Nazi war criminals. And at the exact same time, the United States was secretly bringing Nazi scientists to America, giving them jobs, and helping them avoid prosecution for war crimes. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, and it shows that when it comes to national security, the US government was willing to forgive almost anything, even participation in the Holocaust. As World War II was ending, American intelligence agencies realized something important. Nazi Germany had developed incredibly advanced technology. They had jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, chemical weapons, and rocket technology that was years ahead of anything the Allies had. The most famous example was the V-2 rocket. This was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. The Nazis had used V-2 rockets to bomb London, killing thousands of civilians. The technology was revolutionary, and the Americans wanted it. But the technology was useless without the scientists who developed it. The Americans needed the German engineers, physicists, and chemists who had created these weapons. There was just one problem. Many of these scientists were Nazis. Not just Nazi Party members, some had been deeply involved in war crimes. They had used slave labor from concentration camps. They had conducted experiments on prisoners. They had knowingly worked people to death. Under international law and basic morality, these men should have been prosecuted as war criminals. But the US government had different priorities. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was emerging as America's new enemy, and the Soviets were doing the same thing, grabbing German scientists and technology for themselves. The Americans decided they couldn't let the Soviets get all the Nazi scientists, so they launched a secret program to bring German scientists to America before the Soviets could get them. The program was initially called Operation Overcast. In 1946, it was renamed Operation Paperclip. The name came from the paperclips used to attach new identity documents to the scientists' files. The operation was run by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, a special unit created specifically for this purpose. Their mission was to identify valuable German scientists, bring them to America, and put them to work for the US government. There was supposed to be one rule: no committed Nazis, no war criminals, no one who had participated in atrocities. That rule was immediately broken. The agency created false biographies for the scientists, whitewashing their Nazi pasts. They destroyed or hid evidence of war crimes. They lied to the State Department, to immigration officials, and to the public. President Truman had specifically ordered that no ardent Nazis should be brought to America. But the intelligence agencies ignored him. They decided that the scientists' technical knowledge was more important than their Nazi affiliations or war crime. Let me tell you about some of the men who were brought to America under Operation Paperclip. Werner von Braun was the most famous. He was the chief architect of the V-2 rocket program. Von Braun was a brilliant engineer and a member of the Nazi Party and the SS, the organization responsible for running concentration camps and carrying out the Holocaust. The V-2 rockets that von Braun designed were built by slave laborers at the Mittelwerk factory, which was connected to the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Approximately 20,000 prisoners worked in the underground factory. About 9,000 of them died from exhaustion, starvation, beatings, and executions. Von Braun visited the factory regularly. He knew the rockets were being built by concentration camp prisoners. He knew they were dying. There are documented cases of von Braun personally selecting prisoners from the camp to work on specific projects. When prisoners could no longer work, they were sent back to the camp to die or be executed. The Nazis literally worked people to death to build von Braun's rockets. After the war, von Braun surrendered to American forces. The US military knew about his Nazi past and his use of slave labor. They didn't care. They wanted his rocket expertise. Von Braun was brought to America under Operation Paperclip. His Nazi past was whitewashed. His SS membership was hidden. His role in the deaths of thousands of concentration camp prisoners was swept under the rug. He was given a job at the US Army's rocket development program in Fort Bliss, Texas. Later, he was transferred to NASA, where he became the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon. Werner von Braun became an American hero. He appeared on television. He worked with Walt Disney to promote space exploration. He was celebrated as the father of the American space program. And nobody talked about the concentration camp prisoners who died building his rockets. rockets. Von Braun wasn't the only one. Operation Paperclip brought more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America. Arthur Rudolph was von Braun's colleague and the operations director at the Mittelwerk factory. He was directly responsible for managing the slave labor that built the V-2 rockets. He knew prisoners were being worked to death. He did nothing to stop it. Rudolph was brought to America under Operation Paperclip. He worked for the US Army and later NASA. He was the project director for the Saturn V rocket. In 1969, he received NASA's Distinguished Service Medal. In 1984, when his Nazi past was finally investigated, Rudolph agreed to renounce his US citizenship and leave the country rather than face prosecution. He returned to Germany, where he lived comfortably until his death in 1996. Hubertus Strughold was known as the father of space medicine. He conducted research on the effects of high altitude and extreme conditions on the human body. His research was crucial for developing spacesuits and life support systems, but Strughold's research was based on Nazi experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners. Prisoners were subjected to extreme cold, low pressure, and other tortures disguised as medical experiments. Many died. Strughold claimed he wasn't directly involved in these experiments, but documents show he attended meetings where the experiments were discussed, and he used data from them in his research. He was brought to America under Operation Paperclip and became a leading figure in aerospace medicine. The Strughold Award, named in his honor, was given by the Space Medicine Association until 2013, when his Nazi past became too controversial to ignore. Kurt Blohm was a Nazi doctor who conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners, including infecting them with plague bacteria to test vaccines. He was tried at Nuremberg but acquitted due to lack of evidence, much of which had been destroyed or hidden. After his acquittal, Blohm was recruited by the US Army under Operation Paperclip. He was brought to America to work on chemical warfare research. The government that had just prosecuted Nazis for war crimes was now employing them. Walter Schreiber was a Nazi general who oversaw medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, including freezing experiments and experiments with infectious diseases. He was brought to America and given a job at the Air Force School of Medicine in Texas. When his past was exposed by a journalist, there was public outrage. The military quietly sent him to Argentina, where he lived until his death. These are just a few examples. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists to America. Many of them had Nazi pasts. Some had committed war crimes, and the US government knew and didn't care. The program was kept secret for decades. The American public had no idea that Nazi scientists were working for their government. The scientists were given new identities, their pasts were hidden, and they were integrated into American society. Operation Paperclip wasn't declassified until the 1970s. Even then, the full extent of the program and the war crimes committed by some of the scientists weren't fully revealed until the 1990s. When the truth came out, there were calls for accountability, but by then, most of the scientists were dead or very old. Nobody was prosecuted, nobody faced justice. The government's justification was always the same. We needed their expertise to compete with the Soviets. National security required it. The ends justified the means. But think about what this means. The United States fought World War II to defeat fascism. We prosecuted Nazis at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. We told the world that what the Nazis did was unforgivable. And then we hired them. We gave them jobs, citizenship, and comfortable lives. We let them escape justice. We helped them hide their crimes, and we did it all in secret, without telling the American people that their government was employing Nazi war criminals. Operation Paperclip shows that when it comes to national security, the US government is willing to compromise any principle, forgive any crime, and betray any value. It shows that the Cold War paranoia was so intense that we were willing to embrace our former enemies, even Nazis, if they could help us fight communism. And it shows that justice is negotiable. If you have valuable skills, if you can help the government achieve its goals, your crimes can be forgiven. The programs we've discussed so far involved real science. Twisted and unethical, but based on actual scientific principles. But our next program ventures into something completely different, the government's attempt to develop psychic powers. Chapter 6. The Stargate Project, Psychic Spies. So far, every program we've discussed has been dark and disturbing, but now we're going to talk about something that's just bizarre. For more than 20 years, the US government spent over $20 million trying to develop psychic spies. They recruited people who claimed to have ESP, telepathy, and remote viewing abilities. They conducted thousands of experiments. They tried to use psychic powers to spy on the Soviet Union. This is the story of the Stargate Project. And yes, this actually happened. It sounds like science fiction. It sounds like something from a bad movie. But it's real. The US government genuinely believed that psychic powers might exist and might be useful for intelligence gathering. Here's how it started. In the 1970s, American intelligence agencies heard rumors that the Soviet Union was conducting research into psychic phenomena. The Soviets were supposedly trying to develop telepathy, remote viewing, and psychokinesis, the ability to move objects with your mind. The CIA was worried. What if the Soviets actually succeeded? What if they developed psychic spies who could read minds or see inside secure facilities? What if they could use psychic powers to influence American leaders or sabotage military equipment? It sounds ridiculous now, but remember, this was the Cold War. The CIA had already spent millions on MKUltra trying to develop mind control. They'd tested LSD, hypnosis, and every other method they could think of. Psychic powers didn't seem that much crazier. So in 1972, the CIA began funding research into remote viewing, the supposed ability to see distant locations using only the mind. The research was conducted at the Stanford Research Institute in California. The lead researchers were physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ. They claimed to have found several people with genuine psychic abilities. One of their star subjects was a man named Ingo Swann. Swann claimed he could use remote viewing to see any location on Earth or even in space just by being given coordinates. In one famous experiment, Swann was asked to describe what he saw at specific geographic coordinates. He described a facility with buildings, roads, and equipment. Later, it was revealed that the coordinates corresponded to a secret Soviet military installation. Swann's description was supposedly accurate. The CIA was impressed. If remote viewing actually worked, it could revolutionize intelligence gathering. No more need for spy satellites or human agents. Just give a psychic the coordinates and they could tell you what was there. So the CIA expanded the program. They recruited more psychics. They conducted more experiments. And in 1978, the program was transferred to the Defense Intelligence Agency and given the codename Stargate. Over the next 17 years, the Stargate project would employ dozens of psychics and conduct thousands of remote viewing sessions. The psychics were given military ranks and salaries. They worked in a secure facility at Fort Meade, Maryland. Their mission was to use psychic powers to gather intelligence on America's enemies. So what did they actually do? The psychics were given targets, usually just a set of coordinates or a photograph sealed in an envelope. They would then enter a meditative state and describe what they saw at the target location. The descriptions were often vague and ambiguous. A psychic might say they saw a large structure or water nearby or military activity. The handlers would then try to match these descriptions to known locations. Sometimes the descriptions seemed accurate, sometimes they were completely wrong, but the believers in the program would focus on the hits and ignore the misses. One of the most famous Stargate psychics was Joseph McMoneagle. He was a former Army intelligence officer who claimed to have remote viewing abilities. McMoneagle participated in hundreds of remote viewing sessions. In one case, McMoneagle was asked to locate a Soviet bomber that had crashed in Africa. He described seeing a crashed aircraft in a jungle setting. Later, satellite imagery supposedly confirmed that a Soviet bomber had indeed crashed in the location McMoneagle described. In another case, McMoneagle was asked to describe a new type of Soviet submarine. He drew sketches showing a submarine with a distinctive double hull design. But when the submarine was later photographed, it supposedly matched McMoneagle's drawings. These successes were used to justify continuing the program. But there were problems. First, the successes were rare. For every hit, there were dozens of misses. The psychics were wrong far more often than they were right. Second, the hits were often ambiguous. The psychics would give vague descriptions that could apply to many different locations. Then, when a match was found, it would be declared a success, even if the description could have matched dozens of other places. Third, there was no way to verify the successes independently. The program was classified so outside scientists couldn't examine the data. We only have the word of the program's believers that the hits were genuine. Despite these problems, the Stargate project continued for years. Different branches of the military and intelligence community took turns running it. It was given different code names: Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and finally Stargate. The program was used for various intelligence missions. Psychics were asked to locate hostages, find hidden weapons, describe enemy facilities, and predict future events. During the Iran hostage crisis in 1979 to 1980, Stargate psychics were asked to locate the American hostages being held in Tehran. They provided descriptions of the buildings where the hostages were supposedly being held. It's unclear if any of this information was actually useful. During the first Gulf War in 1991, psychics were asked to locate Saddam Hussein and describe Iraqi military positions. Again, it's unclear if their information was accurate or useful. The problem was that the military couldn't rely on psychic intelligence. Even if remote viewing occasionally produced accurate information, it wasn't reliable enough to base military decisions on. You can't plan a military operation based on a psychic's vague description of a building near water. You need precise, verifiable intelligence. So while the Stargate project continued, it was never taken seriously by most intelligence professionals. It was seen as a fringe program, kept alive by a few true believers, but largely ignored by the mainstream intelligence community. In 1995, the CIA commissioned an independent review of the Stargate project. They brought in outside scientists to evaluate whether remote viewing actually worked. The review was conducted by Professor Jessica Utz, a statistician, and Professor Ray Hyman, a psychologist and skeptic. They examined the data from years of remote viewing experiments. Their conclusions were mixed. Utz concluded that remote viewing had been demonstrated to exist, though she couldn't explain how it worked. Hyman disagreed, arguing that the positive results could be explained by chance, sensory leakage, and confirmation bias. But both reviewers agreed on one crucial point. Even if remote viewing was real, it wasn't useful for intelligence gathering. The information produced was too vague, too unreliable, and too difficult to verify. Based on this review, the CIA decided to terminate the Stargate project. In 1995, after more than 20 years and over $20 million spent, the program was shut down. The CIA declassified some of the Stargate documents and held a press conference to announce the program's existence and termination. The public reaction was a mix of fascination and ridicule. The government had spent $20 million on psychic spies, and they had nothing to show for it. Some of the former Stargate psychics went public after the program ended. They wrote books, gave interviews, and offered remote viewing training courses. They insisted that remote viewing was real and that the program had been successful. Joseph McMoneagle wrote several books about his experiences. Ingo Swann became a prominent figure in the paranormal community. Other former participants started companies offering remote viewing training, but the scientific community remained skeptical. Controlled experiments on remote viewing have consistently failed to produce evidence of psychic abilities. When proper controls are in place to prevent cheating and eliminate bias, remote viewing doesn't work. So what do we make of the Stargate project? On one hand, it's easy to mock. The government spent $20 million on psychic spies. It sounds absurd, but on the other hand, it reveals something important about how the government operates during times of fear and uncertainty. The Cold War created an atmosphere of paranoia. The CIA was terrified that the Soviets might develop some new capability that would give them an advantage. They couldn't afford to ignore any possibility, no matter how unlikely, so they investigated everything: mind control, truth serums, psychic powers. They threw money at any idea that might give them an edge. Most of these programs failed. MKUltra didn't produce mind control, Stargate didn't produce psychic spies, but the government kept trying because the fear of falling behind the Soviets was so intense. The Stargate project also shows how confirmation bias works. The believers in the program focused on the hits and ignored the misses. They interpreted ambiguous results as successes. They convinced themselves that remote viewing worked despite the lack of solid evidence. This is a pattern we see throughout government secrecy. Once a program is classified and hidden from outside scrutiny, it becomes easy for believers to convince themselves it's working, even when it's not. The Stargate project is the least harmful program on this list. Unlike MKUltra or COINTELPRO, it didn't destroy lives. It was just a waste of money. But it's still important because it shows that the government is capable of pursuing absurd ideas for decades, spending millions of dollars, and refusing to admit failure. Now let's get back to the disturbing programs. Remember MKUltra and the CIA's experiments with LSD? Well, there was a sub-project of MKUltra that deserves its own discussion. It involved prostitutes, drugs, and secret apartments with two-way mirrors. Chapter 7, Operation Midnight Climax, Sex, Drugs, and Surveillance. Earlier, I told you about MKUltra, the CIA's mind control program, but there was one sub-project of MKUltra that was so bizarre, so unethical, and so outrageous that it deserves its own chapter. It was called Operation Midnight Climax, and it involved the CIA hiring prostitutes to lure men to secret apartments, where they would be drugged with LSD and filmed having sex through two-way mirrors. Yes, this actually happened. The CIA ran brothels where they drugged and filmed unwitting citizens for science. Let me explain how this insanity came about. As part of MKUltra, the CIA wanted to test LSD in realistic, uncontrolled settings. They wanted to see how people reacted to the drug when they didn't know they'd been dosed. They wanted to observe people in vulnerable, compromising situations. But how do you get people into a vulnerable situation where you can drug them and observe them without their knowledge? The CIA's answer: sex. In 1954, the CIA established a safe house in San Francisco. It was an ordinary apartment in a residential neighborhood, but inside it was anything but ordinary. The apartment was decorated like a bordello, with red velvet curtains, dim lighting, and suggestive artwork. One wall had a two-way mirror. Behind the mirror was an observation room where CIA agents could watch and record everything that happened in the apartment. The CIA hired prostitutes to work at the safe house. The prostitutes would go to bars and nightclubs, pick up men and bring them back to the apartment. The men thought they were just going home with a prostitute for a normal transaction. But once they were in the apartment, the prostitutes would slip LSD into their drinks. Then the CIA agents behind the mirror would watch what happened. The men had no idea they were being drugged. They had no idea they were being watched. They had no idea they were part of a CIA experiment. The operation was run by a CIA agent named George Hunter White. White was a colorful character, a former narcotics agent who had worked undercover in some of the most dangerous drug operations in the country. He was tough, cynical, and had absolutely no qualms about breaking the rules. White loved his job running Operation Midnight Climax. He would sit behind the two-way mirror with a pitcher of martinis, watching drugged men have sex with prostitutes and taking notes. In his own words, White later wrote, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" That's a direct quote from a CIA agent describing his work. He thought it was fun to drug and spy on people. The CIA's justification for Operation Midnight Climax was that they needed to test LSD in realistic scenarios. They wanted to see if the drug could be used to compromise enemy agents. Could you slip LSD into someone's drink at a bar and then extract secrets from them? Could you use sex and drugs to blackmail foreign diplomats? These were the questions the CIA was trying to answer, and they were willing to drug and film unwitting American citizens to find out. the operation expanded beyond San Francisco. The CIA established similar safe houses in New York, Marin County, and other locations. They ran these operations for nearly a decade. The prostitutes were paid by the CIA. They were essentially government employees, though they probably didn't get health insurance or retirement benefits. Their job was to pick up men, bring them to the safe house, drug them, and have sex with them while CIA agents watched. The men who were targeted were usually marginal figures, people who wouldn't be believed if they reported what happened. The CIA specifically targeted people who were unlikely to go to the police, married men who didn't want to admit they'd been with a prostitute, criminals, drug users, and others on the fringes of society. This was deliberate. The CIA wanted test subjects who couldn't fight back, who wouldn't be taken seriously if they complained. But the operation wasn't limited to marginal figures. There are reports that the CIA also used the safe houses to compromise and blackmail people they wanted to control, politicians, journalists, and others who might be useful. The CIA would invite someone to a party at the safe house, drug them, film them in compromising situations, and then use the footage as blackmail. This is speculation based on circumstantial evidence, but given everything else the CIA was doing, it's entirely plausible. Operation Midnight Climax continued until 1965. It only ended because the CIA decided it wasn't producing useful intelligence. They'd learned that LSD wasn't a reliable truth serum and that drugging people didn't make them reveal secrets. It just made them confused and paranoid. So after a decade of drugging and filming people, the CIA concluded that the operation was pointless. They shut it down and moved on to other projects. The existence of Operation Midnight Climax only became public in 1975, when the Church Committee investigated MKUltra. Even then, many of the details remained classified. George Hunter White had retired by then. He died in 1975. The same year the operation was exposed. He never faced any consequences for his actions. The prostitutes who worked for the CIA were never identified publicly. We don't know what happened to them. Presumably they were paid off and told to keep quiet. And the victims, the men who were drugged and filmed, never knew what happened to them. They probably thought that they'd just had a weird experience with a prostitute. They had no idea they'd been part of a CIA experiment. Think about what this means. For a decade, the CIA ran brothels where they drugged and filmed people without consent. They violated every ethical principle, every law, every standard of human decency, and they did it because they thought it might be useful for intelligence gathering. Operation Midnight Climax reveals something deeply disturbing about the CIA's mindset during the Cold War. They believed that anything was justified in the fight against communism. Any violation of rights, any unethical experiment, any crime, it was all acceptable if it might give them an advantage. The operation also shows the CIA's contempt for ordinary citizens. The men who were drugged and filmed weren't enemy agents or foreign spies. They were Americans. Marginal, vulnerable Americans who the CIA thought wouldn't be missed or believed. The CIA treated these people as disposable test subjects. They didn't see them as human beings with rights and dignity. They saw them as objects to be experimented on. And the most infuriating part, nobody was punished. George Hunter White retired with a full pension. The CIA agents who participated in the operation faced no consequences. The agency issued no apologies to the victims, probably because they never identified who the victims were. Operation Midnight Climax is often treated as a bizarre footnote to MKUltra, a weird and salacious detail that gets mentioned for shock value, but it's more than that. It's proof that the CIA was willing to commit sexual assault, because that's what this was. Drugging someone without their consent and then engaging in sexual activity with them is sexual assault. The fact that the CIA paid prostitutes to do it doesn't change that. It's proof that the CIA was willing to violate the most intimate aspects of people's lives. They didn't just spy on people's conversations or read their mail. They drugged them, filmed them having sex, and kept the footage for potential blackmail. And it's proof that the CIA operated with complete impunity. They ran brothels in American cities for a decade. They drugged and filmed American citizens, and when it was finally exposed, nothing happened. No prosecutions, no accountability, just a shrug, and a promise to do better. Operation Midnight Climax ended in 1965, but the mindset that created it didn't end. The belief that the CIA can do whatever it wants in the name of national security, that ordinary citizens are expendable, that the ends always justify the means, that mindset continues. We see it in the torture programs after 9/11. We see it in the mass surveillance programs. We see it every time the government claims that secrecy and security require us to give up our rights and trust them to do the right thing. Operation Midnight Climax is a reminder that we shouldn't trust them, because when given the opportunity, they'll drug you, film you, and use you as a test subject, and they'll call it patriotism. Now let's talk about a different kind of secret operation, one that involved stealing a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the ocean using a ship built by a billionaire. This one sounds like a James Bond movie, but it actually happened. Chapter 8, Project Azorian, Stealing a Soviet Submarine. In 1968, a Soviet submarine sank in the Pacific Ocean, 3 miles below the surface. The submarine contained nuclear missiles, code books, and encryption equipment. The Soviets searched for it but couldn't find it. The CIA found it, and then they decided to steal it. This is the story of Project Azorian, one of the most ambitious, expensive, and audacious covert operations in CIA history. It involved building a massive ship, creating a fake company, using Howard Hughes as a cover story, and attempting to lift a 2,000-ton submarine from the ocean floor. And somehow, they almost pulled it off. Let me set the scene. It's March 1968. A Soviet Gulf-class ballistic missile submarine designated K-129 is on patrol in the Pacific Ocean, about 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. Something goes wrong. The submarine sinks rapidly, taking all 98 crew members to their deaths. The Soviets launch a massive search operation, but they can't locate the wreckage. The ocean is vast, and their search technology is limited. But the United States Navy has something the Soviets don't: an advanced underwater listening system called SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System. SOSUS is a network of underwater microphones designed to detect Soviet submarines. SOSUS picked up the sound of K-129 sinking. The US Navy was able to calculate approximately where the submarine went down. They sent the USS Halibut, a specially equipped submarine, to search for the wreckage. In August 1968, the Halibut found K-129. The submarine was sitting on the ocean floor, 3 miles down, broken into pieces but largely intact. The CIA was immediately interested. K-129 was carrying nuclear missiles. It had code books and encryption equipment. It might have documents revealing Soviet military secrets. If the CIA could recover the submarine, it would be an intelligence goldmine. There was just one problem. The submarine was 3 miles underwater. In 1968, no one had ever recovered anything from that depth. Technology didn't exist, but the CIA decided to try. Anyway, they launched a top-secret program called Project Azorian. The goal was to build a ship capable of lifting the submarine from the ocean floor without the Soviets knowing what they were doing. This required solving enormous technical challenges. They needed a ship with a lifting mechanism powerful enough to raise 2,000 tons from 3 miles down. They needed to do it in secret, in the middle of the ocean, without the Soviets noticing. And they needed a cover story to explain what the ship was doing. The CIA's solution was brilliant. They would build the ship and claim it was a deep-sea mining vessel designed to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. This was a real thing. Companies were exploring deep-sea mining in the 1970s. And to make the cover story believable, they would use Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was one of the richest men in America, a billionaire industrialist, aviator, and film producer. By the 1970s, he had become a recluse, living in hotels and rarely appearing in public. Hughes was perfect for the CIA's purposes. He was known for eccentric projects. He had the money to fund a deep-sea mining operation, and he was so reclusive that he wouldn't contradict whatever story the CIA told. The CIA approached Hughes's company, Summa Corporation, and made a deal. They would build the ship under the cover of Hughes's mining company. If anyone asked, it was a Hughes project, not a CIA operation. Hughes agreed. Whether he was a willing participant or was coerced is unclear, but his name and company provided the perfect cover. The CIA created a fake company called Global Marine Development Inc. to build the ship. They hired real engineers and shipbuilders, most of whom had no idea they were working for the CIA. They thought they were building a mining vessel for Howard Hughes. The ship was called the Hughes Glomar Explorer. It was massive, 19 feet long, one of the largest ships ever built at the time. The cost was staggering. Estimates range from $350 million to $800 million, making it one of the most expensive covert operations in CIA history. The ship had a unique design. In the center was a massive opening called the Moon Pool, a hole that went straight through the ship from the deck to the bottom. Suspended in the moon pool was a giant claw-like device called the capture vehicle. The plan was to position the ship over the submarine, lower the capture vehicle 3 miles down, grab the submarine with the claw, and lift it up through the moon pool into the ship's hold. The entire operation would happen inside the ship, hidden from view. It was an engineering marvel. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. Construction of the Hughes Glomar Explorer took years. The ship was finally completed in 1973. In July 1974, the ship sailed to the location where K-129 had sunk. The Soviets were watching. They knew the ship was there, but they believed the cover story. They thought it was a mining vessel. Soviet ships shadowed the Glomar Explorer, but they didn't interfere. The CIA crew began the operation. They lowered the capture vehicle 3 miles down to the ocean floor. Using cameras and sonar, they maneuvered the claw around the submarine wreckage, and then they grabbed it. The claw closed around the submarine. The lifting mechanism engaged. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the submarine began to rise. For days, the submarine was lifted inch by inch through 3 miles of ocean. The tension was incredible. If the cables snapped, if the claw failed, if the Soviets figured out what was happening, the entire operation would fail. And then, disaster struck. About 2/3 of the way up, part of the submarine broke apart. The claw was holding the submarine by its weakest point, and the weight was too much. A large section of the submarine, including the area where the nuclear missiles and codebooks were stored, broke off and fell back to the ocean floor. The CIA managed to recover only the front third of the submarine. They brought it up into the ship's hold and examined what they had. Inside, they found the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors. They found some equipment and documents, but they didn't get the nuclear missiles, the codebooks, or most of the intelligence they were hoping for. The CIA gave the 6 Soviet sailors a proper burial at sea, which they filmed. Years later, after the operation was declassified, the CIA gave the film to the Russian government as a gesture of respect, but the operation was only a partial success. They'd spent hundreds of millions of dollars and recovered only a fraction of the submarine. The CIA wanted to try again. They wanted to go back and recover the rest of the submarine. But before they could, the operation was exposed. In 1975, investigative journalist Jack Anderson learned about Project Azorian and was preparing to publish the story. The CIA asked him not to. They said it would compromise national security and endanger the planned second recovery mission. Anderson agreed to hold the story temporarily, but other journalists got wind of it, and in March 1975, the New York Times published an article revealing Project Azorian. The Soviets were furious. They'd been watching the Hughes Glomar Explorer, but they'd believed the mining cover story. Now they knew the CIA had tried to steal their submarine. The second recovery mission was cancelled. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was mothballed. The CIA's ambitious plan to recover K-129 was over. But Project Azorian had one lasting legacy: the Glomar response. After the operation was exposed, journalists filed Freedom of Information Act requests asking for documents about Project Azorian. The CIA didn't want to confirm or deny the operation's existence, So they created a new type of response. They said, we can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the information requested. This became known as the Glomar response, named after the Hughes. Glomar Explorer. It's now a standard legal phrase used by government agencies when they don't want to confirm or deny something. So every time you hear a government official say, I can neither confirm nor deny, you're hearing an echo of Project Azorian. Project Azorian is different from the other programs we've discussed. It wasn't unethical, it didn't violate anyone's rights, it was just an incredibly ambitious intelligence operation. But it reveals something important about the CIA's capabilities and mindset. They were willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a single operation. They were willing to build a massive ship and create an elaborate cover story. They were willing to attempt something that seemed impossible, and they almost succeeded. Project Azorian shows that when the CIA wants to do something, they have nearly unlimited resources and incredible technical capabilities. If they can build a ship to steal a submarine from 3 miles underwater, what else can they do? It also shows the lengths the CIA will go to for intelligence. They spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars to recover a Soviet submarine that might contain useful information. They didn't know if it would be worth it, but they tried anyway. The programs we've discussed so far are historical. They happened decades ago. But our next program is recent. It's still affecting you right now, at this very moment. Chapter 9. PRISM and NSA surveillance. They're watching everything. Every program we've discussed so far is historical. MKUltra ended in the 1970s. COINTELPRO was shut down. Operation Paperclip is long over. But this next program is different. This one is still happening. Right now, as you listen to this, the US government is collecting data on your phone calls, your emails, your internet searches, your social media posts. This is the story of PRISM and the NSA's mass surveillance programs. And unlike the other programs, we only know about this one because of a whistleblower who sacrificed everything to tell us the truth. His name is Edward Snowden. Let's start with what we thought we knew before 2013. Most Americans assumed the government could monitor suspected terrorists and criminals with a warrant. That seemed reasonable. If the FBI thinks you're planning a terrorist attack, they should be able to tap your phone with court approval. But we assumed that ordinary citizens weren't being surveilled. We assumed our private communications were private. We assumed the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches, still meant something. We were wrong. In June 2013, a 29-year-old NSA contractor named Edward Snowden leaked thousands of classified documents to journalists Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. These documents revealed the existence of massive surveillance programs that most Americans had no idea existed. The revelations were stunning. The NSA wasn't just monitoring suspected terrorists. They were collecting data on everyone. Every American, every person in the world who used American technology companies. Let me tell you about PRISM. PRISM is a surveillance program that gives the NSA direct access to the servers of major tech companies. Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Apple, YouTube, Skype, AOL and others. Through PRISM, the NSA can access your emails, your chat messages, your photos, your videos, your search history, your social media posts. They can see who you communicate with, what you say, what you search for, what websites you visit. Tech companies initially denied giving the NSA direct access to their servers, but the leaked documents proved it was happening. Eventually, the companies admitted they were complying with government orders, though they claimed they only provided data in response to specific legal requests. But PRISM was just one program. Snowden documents revealed many others. There was a program called Upstream, where the NSA tapped directly into the fiber optic cables that carry internet traffic. They were literally intercepting data as it flowed through the internet's infrastructure. There was a program where the NSA collected the phone records of millions of Verizon customers. Not the content of the calls, but the metadata. Who called whom, when, and for how long. Later revelations showed this wasn't just Verizon, it was all major phone companies. The NSA claimed that metadata wasn't a big deal, it's just numbers, not the actual conversations. But metadata reveals everything. It shows who you talk to, how often, for how long. It It shows your patterns, your relationships, your habits. As former NSA Director Michael Hayden said, we kill people based on metadata. If metadata is good enough to target drone strikes, it's pretty damn revealing. There was a program called Muscular, where the NSA hacked into the private networks connecting Google and Yahoo data centers. These were supposed to be secure internal networks, but the NSA found a way in and was copying everything. There was a program where the NSA collected millions of images from webcams, including sexually explicit images captured without the user's knowledge or consent. There were programs to crack encryption, to weaken security standards, to install backdoors in software and hardware. The NSA was even spying on foreign leaders, including allies. They tapped German Chancellor Angela Merkel's personal cell phone. They monitored the communications of 35 world leaders. The scope of the surveillance was breathtaking. The NSA was collecting billions of pieces of data every single day. They were storing it in massive data centers. They were using sophisticated algorithms to analyze it, looking for patterns and connections. And they were doing all of this in secret, without public debate, without meaningful oversight. The legal justification for all this surveillance was a law called the Patriot Act, passed after 9/11. Section 215 of the Patriot Act allowed the government to collect business records that were relevant to a terrorism investigation. The NSA interpreted this incredibly broadly. They argued that all phone records were relevant to terrorism investigations, because you never know which records might be useful. Therefore, they could collect everyone's phone records. This interpretation was approved by a secret court called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISA Court. This court operates in complete secrecy. The proceedings are classified. Only the government presents arguments. There's no one arguing for privacy or civil liberties. The FISA court almost never denies government requests. From 1979 to 2012, the court approved over 33,000 surveillance requests and denied only 11. So the NSA was operating with a blank check from a secret court, using a broad interpretation of a law that most Americans didn't understand. And nobody knew about it until Edward Snowden leaked the documents. Snowden was working as a contractor for the NSA in Hawaii. He had access to classified systems and documents. As he learned about the surveillance programs, he became increasingly disturbed. He saw that the NSA was violating the privacy of millions of innocent people. He saw that the programs went far beyond what was necessary for national security. He saw that the American people were being lied to about the extent of government surveillance. Snowden faced a choice. He could keep quiet, keep his job, keep his comfortable life, or he could expose the truth and face the consequences. He chose to expose the truth. Snowden carefully copied thousands of classified documents. In May 2013, he flew to Hong Kong. He met with journalists Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and gave them the documents. On June 5, 2013, The Guardian published the first story based on Snowden's leaks. The NSA was collecting phone records of millions of Verizon customers. The next day, The Washington Post revealed PRISM. Over the following weeks and months, more revelations came out, each one more shocking than the last. The US government was furious. They revoked Snowden's passport and charged him with espionage. They pressured countries not to grant him asylum. Snowden was stuck in the Moscow airport for weeks, unable to travel. Eventually, Russia granted him temporary asylum. He's been living in Russia ever since, unable to return to the United States without facing prosecution. The government called Snowden a traitor. They said he damaged national security, endangered lives, and helped terrorists. But Snowden's supporters called him a hero and a whistleblower. They said he'd exposed illegal surveillance and defended the Constitution. So what actually happened after the revelations? There was public outrage. There were protests. Civil liberties groups filed lawsuits. Tech companies, embarrassed by their cooperation with the NSA, began implementing stronger encryption. Congress held hearings. Intelligence officials were forced to testify publicly. Director of National Intelligence James Clapper was asked directly, "Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions of Americans?" Clapper answered, "No, sir, this was a lie. The Snowden documents proved it was a lie." Clapper later admitted he gave the least untruthful answer he could. Think about that. The Director of National Intelligence lied to Congress under oath about mass surveillance, and he faced no consequences. He wasn't prosecuted for perjury. He kept his job. Eventually, there were some reforms. In 2015, Congress passed the USA Freedom Act, which ended the NSA's bulk collection of phone records. Now, the phone companies store the records, and the NSA has to request specific records with court approval. But most of the surveillance programs continue. PRISM still exists. The NSA still collects massive amounts of data. The FISA court still operates in secret. The surveillance has just become slightly more regulated, but it hasn't stopped. And here's the thing. We only know about these programs because Edward Snowden leaked the documents. How many other surveillance programs exist that we don't know about? The NSA's budget is classified. Their capabilities are classified. We have no idea what they're actually capable of doing. We know they can hack into computers and phones. We know they can crack encryption. We know they can intercept communications, but we don't know the full extent of their capabilities. And that's terrifying. The NSA surveillance programs show that the government will push its powers as far as it can. They'll interpret laws as broadly as possible. They'll operate in secret. They'll lie to Congress and the public, and they'll only stop when they're caught. The programs also show how technology has changed surveillance. In the past, if the government wanted to spy on you, they had to physically tap your phone or open your mail. It was labor-intensive and limited. Now, surveillance is automated and universal. The NSA can collect data on millions of people simultaneously. They can store it indefinitely. They can analyze it with algorithms. This creates a surveillance state that would have been impossible in the past. The government has the capability to monitor everyone, all the time. They say they only use this capability to fight terrorism. They say there are safeguards and oversight. They say we should trust them, but we've seen what happens when we trust the government with secret powers. We get MKUltra, we get COINTELPRO, we get Tuskegee. The NSA surveillance programs are the modern version of those abuses. They're happening right now. And unless we demand accountability and real oversight, they'll continue. We've covered 9 programs so far, but there's one more I need to tell you about. It's one of the most disturbing because it shows the government manipulating the media to control what Americans think. Chapter 10. Operation Mockingbird, the CIA controls the media. Imagine turning on the news and trusting that what you're hearing is the truth. Imagine reading a newspaper article and believing the journalist wrote it independently, without government influence. Now imagine learning that the CIA had secretly recruited hundreds of journalists, editors, and media executives, that they were planting stories in major newspapers, that they were using the media as a propaganda tool to manipulate public opinion. This is the story of Operation Mockingbird, and it shows that the line between news and propaganda is thinner than you think. Operation Mockingbird began in the early 1950s, during the height of the Cold War. The CIA wanted to influence public opinion both domestically and internationally. They wanted to promote anti-communist narratives and discredit anyone who questioned US foreign policy. Their solution was to infiltrate the media. The operation was allegedly organized by CIA officials, including Frank Wisner, Alan Dulles, and Philip Graham. The goal was to recruit journalists and media executives who would cooperate with the CIA, either knowingly or unknowingly. The CIA would provide these journalists with information, story ideas, and even pre-written articles. The journalists would publish them as their own work without disclosing the CIA's involvement. In return, the journalists got access to exclusive information, insider sources, and career advancement. The CIA got to shape the news. How extensive was this infiltration? In 1977, journalist Carl Bernstein, famous for exposing Watergate, published an article in Rolling Stone titled "The CIA and the Media." Bernstein had spent 6 months investigating the CIA's relationship with the press. His findings were shocking. Bernstein reported that more than 400 American journalists had secretly carried out assignments for the CIA over the previous 25 years. These weren't fringe bloggers or small-town reporters. These were journalists at the most prestigious news organizations in America: New York Times, CBS, Time Magazine, Newsweek, the Associated Press, Reuters, and many others. Some of these journalists were full-time CIA employees posing as reporters. Others were actual journalists who cooperated with the CIA on specific stories. Some knew they were working for the CIA. Others thought they were just cultivating government sources. The CIA also had relationships with media executives and publishers. These executives would kill stories that were damaging to the CIA or publish stories that served the agency's interests. One of the most important CIA assets was Philip Graham, publisher of the Washington Post. Graham was a close friend of CIA officials and helped recruit other journalists into the program. After Graham's death in 1963, his wife Catherine Graham took over the Post and reportedly continued the relationship with the CIA. Ironically, the Washington Post would later become famous for exposing government wrongdoing with Watergate. But in the 1950s and 60s, the Post was helping the CIA spread propaganda. The CIA also had extensive relationships with the major television network. CBS was particularly cooperative. CIA Director Alan Dulles boasted about the agency's productive relationship with CBS. William Paley, the founder and chairman of CBS, allowed the CIA to use CBS as cover for CIA agents operating abroad. Journalists with CBS credentials could travel the world gathering intelligence for the CIA. CBS News president Sig Mickelson later admitted that he had cooperated with the CIA, allowing the agency to use CBS facilities and personnel for intelligence operations. So what kind of stories did the CIA plant? During the Cold War, the CIA used Operation Mockingbird to promote anti-communist propaganda. They planted stories exaggerating Soviet military capabilities to justify increased defense spending. They spread disinformation about communist movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. They also used the media to discredit critics of US foreign policy. If someone questioned American intervention in Vietnam or Latin America, CIA would plant stories suggesting they were communist sympathizers or Soviet agents. The CIA didn't just plant stories in American media. They also funded and controlled foreign media outlets. They created fake news organizations in other countries to spread pro-American propaganda. One example was Radio Free Europe, which broadcast into Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. Radio Free Europe was presented as an independent news organization, but it was actually funded and controlled by the CIA. The CIA also funded newspapers, magazines, and publishing houses around the world. They would publish books by anti-communist authors, sometimes without the authors knowing the CIA was involved. Operation Mockingbird wasn't just about promoting pro-American stories. It was also about suppressing stories that made the CIA look bad. When journalists stumbled onto stories about CIA operations, coups, assassinations, drug trafficking, the CIA would use its media contacts to kill the stories or discredit the journalists. If a story did get published, the CIA would plant counter-stories in friendly outlets to muddy the waters and create confusion. This is how the CIA maintained secrecy for so long. It wasn't just that their operations were classified, it was that they controlled the media outlets that might expose them. Operation Mockingbird started to unravel in the 1970s, during the same period when MKUltra and COINTELPRO were exposed. In 1975, the Church Committee investigated CIA abuses, including the agency's relationship with the media. The committee found that the CIA had maintained relationships with dozens of journalists and media organizations. The committee's report stated, CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempt to influence opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets. Notice the careful language. Foreign individuals and foreign media outlet. The committee was reluctant to fully expose the CIA's manipulation of American media, but the truth was leaking out. Carl Bernstein's 1977 article provided more details. Other journalists began investigating and publishing their findings. The CIA was forced to respond. In 1976, CIA Director George H.W. Bush announced new guidelines that supposedly ended the CIA's use of journalists as intelligence assets. But the guidelines had loopholes. The CIA could still maintain relationships with journalists for routine purposes, They could still use journalists who volunteered to help, and the guidelines only applied to accredited American journalists. Foreign journalists and freelancers were fair game. So did Operation Mockingbird actually end, or did it just become more careful? We don't know. The CIA's current relationships with journalists are classified. We have no way of knowing if the agency still plants stories or influences coverage. But we do know that the CIA still has a massive public relations operation. They have an Office of Public Affairs that regularly interacts with journalists. They provide background briefings, arrange interviews with officials, and offer access to information. Is this normal government press relations, or is it a continuation of Operation Mockingbird under a different name? The line is blurry, and that's exactly how the CIA wants it. Operation Mockingbird has had lasting effects on journalism and public trust. First, it corrupted journalism. The job of journalists is to hold the powerful accountable, to investigate and expose wrongdoing. Operation Mockingbird turned journalists into government propagandists. When journalists secretly work for the CIA, they're not journalists anymore. They're intelligence agents pretending to be journalists. This betrays the public's trust. We rely on journalists to tell us the truth. If we can't trust that journalists are independent, then we can't trust anything we read or watch. Second, Operation Mockingbird shows how propaganda works in a democracy. In authoritarian countries, the government openly controls the media. Everyone knows it's propaganda. But in America, propaganda is hidden. The media appears independent. The journalists appear to be doing their jobs. But behind the scenes, the CIA is shaping the narrative. This is more effective than open propaganda because people don't realize they're being manipulated. Third, Operation Mockingbird explains why certain stories don't get covered. Why did it take so long for the media to question the Vietnam War? Why were CIA coups in Latin America barely reported? Why did the media uncritically repeat government claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Maybe it's because journalists were incompetent or lazy. Or maybe it's because the CIA was actively suppressing these stories and planting counter-narratives. We'll never know for sure because the CIA's media operations are secret. The most disturbing aspect of Operation Mockingbird is that it undermines the foundation of democracy. Democracy requires an informed public. The public needs accurate information to make decisions about who to vote for and what policies to support. But if the CIA is secretly manipulating the media, then the public isn't getting accurate information. They're getting propaganda disguised as news. This means that democratic decisions are being made based on false information. The public thinks they're making informed choices, but they're actually being manipulated. Operation Mockingbird shows that the CIA doesn't just operate overseas. They operate domestically, manipulating American public opinion, shaping the national conversation, and controlling the narrative. And they do it all in secret, without accountability, without oversight. When you watch the news tonight, ask yourself, how do I know this is true? How do I know the journalist isn't working for the CIA? How do I know this story wasn't planted by the government? The answer is, you don't know. You can't know. And that's exactly what Operation Mockingbird achieved. It made it impossible to trust the media. We've now covered 10 secret government programs. 10 examples of the government lying, manipulating, experimenting, and violating rights. But what does it all mean? What are we supposed to do with this information? Let me bring it all together. Conclusion Part 1. Patterns and lessons. We've just covered 10 secret government programs. Let me recap what we've learned. MKUltra, the CIA drugged unwitting citizens with LSD, conducted brutal mind control experiments, and destroyed most of the evidence. COINTELPRO, the FBI infiltrated, disrupted, and destroyed political movements, sent a suicide letter to Martin Luther King Jr., and helped assassinate Fred Hampton. Operation Northwoods, the military planned to stage terrorist attacks on American citizens to justify invading Cuba. The plan was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Tuskegee study, the government watched black men die from syphilis for 40 years, even after a cure was available, and actively prevented them from getting treatment. Operation Paperclip, the US brought over 1,600 Nazi scientists to America, whitewashed their war crimes and gave them jobs in the military and NASA. The Stargate project, the government spent $20 million over 20 years trying to develop psychic spies. Operation Midnight Climax, CIA ran brothels where they drugged and filmed people having sex, using prostitutes as government employees. Project Azorian, the CIA spent hundreds of millions of dollars building a massive ship to steal a Soviet submarine from the ocean floor. PRISM and NSA surveillance. The government is currently collecting data on your phone calls, emails, and internet activity, and they lied about it until Edward Snowden exposed them. Operation Mockingbird, the CIA recruited hundreds of journalists and used the media to spread propaganda and suppress stories. These aren't conspiracy theories, these are documented facts. These programs actually happened. We know about them because of declassified documents, congressional investigations, and whistleblowers. Now let's talk about the patterns. Pattern number 1. The government will do anything in the name of national security. Every single one of these programs was justified by national security. MKUltra was necessary to compete with Soviet mind control research. COINTELPRO was necessary to protect America from communists and radicals. Operation Northwoods was necessary to stop Castro. National security is the magic phrase that justifies any abuse, any violation of rights, any crime. And here's the thing, the threats were often exaggerated or fabricated. The Soviets didn't have mind control technology. The Black Panthers weren't trying to overthrow the government. Cuba wasn't a genuine threat to American security, but the government used fear to justify programs that had nothing to do with legitimate security needs. Pattern number 2. The government operates in secret and lies when caught. All of these programs were secret. The public didn't know about them. Congress often didn't know about them. Even presidents sometimes didn't know the full extent of what the CIA and FBI were doing. When the programs were exposed, the government's first response was always to deny, minimize, and lie. The CIA denied MKUltra until the documents were found. The FBI denied COINTELPRO until the files were stolen. The NSA denied mass surveillance until Snowden leaked the proof. Even when caught red-handed, government officials lie. Remember James Clapper lying to Congress about NSA surveillance? Remember the CIA claiming MKUltra was just a few isolated experiments? The government lies, constantly, reflexively, and they only tell the truth when they have no other choice. Pattern number 3. Vulnerable people are always the victims. Look at who these programs targeted. MKUltra experimented on prisoners, mental patients, and drug addicts. People who couldn't fight back. COINTELPRO targeted black activists, anti-war protesters, and political dissidents, people the establishment wanted to silence. Tuskegee used poor black sharecroppers, people who were seen as disposable. Operation Midnight Climax targeted marginal figures, people who wouldn't be believed if they complained. The government doesn't experiment on senators or CEOs. They experiment on the powerless. They target people who can't defend themselves, who won't be believed, who society doesn't care about. This is a feature, not a bug. The government deliberately chooses victims who can't fight back. Pattern number 4. Nobody is held accountable. How many people were prosecuted for MKUltra? 0. How many FBI agents went to jail for COINTELPRO? 0. How many CIA officials faced consequences for Operation Midnight Climax? 0. How many NSA officials were punished for lying about mass surveillance? 0. The only person who faced consequences for NSA surveillance was Edward Snowden, the whistleblower who exposed it. This is the pattern. The government commits crimes, gets caught, and nobody is punished. Maybe there's an apology decades later. Maybe there are some reforms. But nobody goes to jail. Nobody loses their pension. Nobody faces real consequences. Meanwhile, whistleblowers who exposed these programs are prosecuted, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The message is clear. If you commit crimes for the government, you're protected. If you expose government crimes, you're destroyed. Pattern number 5. The programs only end when they're exposed. None of these programs ended because the government decided they were wrong. They ended because they were exposed. MKUltra continued until the documents were discovered. COINTELPRO continued until the files were stolen. NSA surveillance continues today, just slightly reformed after Snowden's leaks. If these programs hadn't been exposed, they'd still be running. The government doesn't stop abusing power voluntarily. They only stop when they're caught. And here's the terrifying question. What programs are running right now that we don't know about? We only know about these 10 programs because of accidents, leaks, and whistleblowers. How many other programs exist that haven't been exposed yet? The NSA's budget is classified. The CIA's operations are secret. We have no idea what they're actually doing. Based on history, we should assume they're doing things that would shock and horrify us, because that's what they've always done. Pattern number 6. Technology makes the abuses worse. Compare COINTELPRO to NSA surveillance. COINTELPRO required FBI agents to physically infiltrate groups, open mail and tap phones. It was labor-intensive and limited in scope. NSA surveillance is automated and universal. They can monitor everyone all the time with minimal human involvement. As technology advances, the government's ability to surveil, control, and manipulate increases exponentially. In the 1960s, the FBI could tap your phone if they targeted you specifically. Today, the NSA collects everyone's data automatically. In the 1950s, the CIA could plant stories in a few newspapers. Today, with social media and algorithmic content distribution, the potential for manipulation is vastly greater. The abuses of the past were terrible, but the abuses of the future will be worse because the technology will be more powerful. Pattern number 7. Reforms are cosmetic. After each scandal, there are reforms. After MKUltra, there were new rules about human experimentation. After COINTELPRO, there were new guidelines for FBI investigations. After Snowden, there was the USA Freedom Act. But the reforms are always limited. They address the specific program that was exposed, but they don't address the underlying problem, the government's belief that it can do whatever it wants in the name of national security. The reforms create the appearance of accountability without actually limiting government power. The CIA can't drug people with LSD anymore, but they can still conduct experiments. The FBI can't send suicide letters to activists, but they can still infiltrate and disrupt political movements. The NSA can't collect bulk phone records, but they can still access your emails and internet activity. The abuses continue. They just become more sophisticated and harder to detect. So what do we do with this information? Some people hear these stories and become cynical. They think the government is corrupt, nothing matters, we're powerless. But that's the wrong lesson. The right lesson is vigilance is essential. These programs were exposed because people fought to expose them. Journalists investigated. Whistleblowers came forward. Activists demanded accountability. Congressional committees held hearings. The system is broken, but it's not completely broken. There are still mechanisms for accountability. They just require constant pressure to work. We need to support whistleblowers, not prosecute them. We need to demand transparency, not accept secrecy. We need to hold officials accountable, not let them retire with pensions after committing crimes. We need to be skeptical of government claims about national security. Every time the government says trust us, this is necessary for your safety, we should remember MKUltra, COINTELPRO, and NSA surveillance. We need to protect vulnerable people because they're always the first target. When the government starts targeting one group, it's a warning that they'll eventually target everyone. We need to fight for privacy and civil liberties because once they're gone, they're almost impossible to get back. And we need to remember that these programs actually happened. This isn't paranoia. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The government drugged citizens, assassinated activists, recruited Nazis, ran brothels, and spied on everyone. They did it before. They're doing it now. They'll do it again unless we stop them. Now, I want to address something important. Throughout this video, I've been critical of the government. Some people might say I'm being unpatriotic or that I'm undermining trust in institutions. But here's the thing. Real patriotism means holding your government accountable. Conclusion. Part 2. Patriotism, Trust, and Democracy. Real patriotism means holding your government accountable. The Founding Fathers understood this. That's why they created the Bill of Rights. That's why they built checks and balances into the Constitution. They knew that power corrupts, and they knew that governments would abuse their authority if left unchecked. Thomas Jefferson said, "When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty." The government should fear the people, not in a violent way, but in the sense that they should know they'll be held accountable for their actions. But somewhere along the way, we reversed that relationship. Now the people fear the government. We're afraid to speak out, afraid to protest, afraid that we're being watched. And we should be afraid, because we are being watched. The NSA proved that. But fear shouldn't lead to silence. It should lead to action. Criticizing the government isn't unpatriotic. Exposing government crimes isn't unpatriotic. Demanding accountability isn't unpatriotic. You know what's unpatriotic? Drugging citizens without their consent, assassinating activists, lying to Congress, violating the Constitution. The CIA, the FBI, and the NSA committed crimes against the American people. They violated the very principles this country was founded on. And when we expose those crimes, we're not attacking America, we're defending it. We're defending the America that's supposed to stand for freedom, justice, and human rights. We're defending the Constitution. We're defending the idea that the government serves the people, not the other way around. So no, I'm not being unpatriotic. The government officials who ran these programs were unpatriotic. I'm just telling you what they did. Now let's talk about trust. Should you trust the government? Based on the evidence we've discussed, the answer is clearly no. You should not blindly trust the government. But that doesn't mean you should assume everything the government says is a lie. It doesn't mean you should reject all government institutions. It means you should be skeptical. You should demand evidence. You should question official narratives. When the government says, "Trust us, this is for your safety," you should ask, "How do I know that's true? What evidence do you have? Who's providing oversight?" When the government says, "We need these powers to fight terrorism," you should ask, "What are the limits on these powers? How will you prevent abuse? What happens if you're wrong?" When the government says, "This program is necessary for national security," you should remember that they said the same thing about MKUltra, COINTELPRO, and mass surveillance. Healthy skepticism isn't paranoia, it's wisdom based on historical evidence. The government has earned our skepticism. They've lied repeatedly. They've abused their power repeatedly. They've violated our rights repeatedly. Trust has to be earned, and the government hasn't earned it. But here's the nuanced part. Not everyone in government is corrupt. There are good people working in government who genuinely want to serve the public. The problem isn't that every individual government employee is evil. The problem is that the institutions themselves are structured to enable abuse. The CIA operates in secret with minimal oversight. The NSA has vast technological capabilities and uses them with little accountability. The FBI has a history of targeting political dissidents. These institutions have too much power and too little oversight. And when institutions have unchecked power, abuse is inevitable. It doesn't matter if the individuals are good people. The structure itself creates the conditions for abuse. That's why reform is so difficult. You can't just replace the bad people with good people. You have to change the institutions themselves. You have to reduce their power. You have to increase transparency. You have to create real accountability mechanisms. And that requires political will, which requires public pressure, which requires an informed and engaged citizenry, which brings me to the most important point. This is about democracy. Democracy only works if the people are informed. If the government operates in secret, if they lie to the public, if they manipulate the media, then democracy becomes a facade. You can't make informed decisions if you don't have accurate information. You can't hold officials accountable if you don't know what they're doing. That's why these secret programs are so dangerous. They don't just violate individual rights. They undermine democracy itself. When the CIA manipulates the media through Operation Mockingbird, they're not just spreading propaganda, they're preventing the public from making informed decisions. When the NSA conducts mass surveillance, They're not just violating privacy, they're creating a chilling effect where people are afraid to speak freely. When the FBI infiltrates and disrupts political movements through COINTELPRO, they're not just targeting activists, they're preventing democratic participation. These programs attack the foundations of democracy: free speech, free press, privacy, and the right to political participation. And they do it in secret, so the public doesn't even know it's happening. This is why whistleblowers are so important. They're the last line of defense against secret government abuse. Edward Snowden sacrificed his freedom to tell us about NSA surveillance. Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to expose government lies about Vietnam. Chelsea Manning leaked documents showing war crimes in Iraq. These whistleblowers are heroes. They risked everything to defend democracy and inform the public, but the government treats them as traitors. They're prosecuted under the Espionage Act. They're imprisoned or forced into exile. Meanwhile, the officials who committed the actual crimes, who lied to Congress, who violated the Constitution, who abused their power, face no consequences. This is backwards. We should be protecting whistleblowers and prosecuting the officials who commit crimes. But that won't happen unless we demand it. The government won't reform itself. Change only happens when the public demands it. So what can you do? First, educate yourself. Learn about these programs. Read the declassified documents. Understand the history. Don't just take my word for it. Do your own research. The documents are publicly available. The congressional reports are online. The evidence is there. Second, educate others. Share this information, talk about it. Don't let these programs be forgotten. The government wants these stories to fade away. They want people to think, that was in the past, things are different now. But things aren't different. The abuses continue. We need to keep these stories alive so people understand what the government is capable of. Third, support organizations that fight for civil liberties and government transparency. Organizations like the ACL Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Freedom of the Press Foundation. These organizations file lawsuits, lobby for reform, and defend whistleblowers. They need public support to continue their work. Fourth, contact your representatives. Demand oversight of intelligence agencies, demand protection for whistleblowers, demand transparency. Politicians respond to public pressure. If enough people demand change, change becomes possible. Fifth, protect your privacy. Use encryption. Use secure communication tools. Don't make it easy for the government to spy on you. This isn't paranoia. This is basic digital hygiene in an age of mass surveillance. Sixth, think critically about the news you consume. Remember Operation Mockingbird. Ask yourself, who benefits from this narrative? What information might be missing? What's the source? Don't blindly trust any news source, including alternative media. Verify information. Look for primary sources. Think critically. Seventh, defend vulnerable people. Remember that the government always targets the powerless first. When you see the government targeting immigrants or protesters or minority communities, speak up, because if you don't defend them, there will be no one to defend you when they come for you. Eighth, vote. But don't just vote. Vote for candidates who support transparency, civil liberties, and accountability. Both major parties have supported these secret programs. Both Democrats and Republicans have expanded surveillance, prosecuted whistleblowers, and protected intelligence agencies from accountability. We need to demand better. We need to support candidates who will actually reform these institutions. Finally, don't give in to cynicism or despair. Yes, the government has done terrible things. Yes, the system is broken. Yes, reform is difficult. But change is possible. These programs were exposed. Some of them were ended or reformed. Whistleblowers came forward. Journalists investigated. The public demanded accountability. It's not enough, but it's something. And it shows that resistance is possible. The government wants you to feel powerless. They want you to think, there's nothing I can do, they're too powerful. But that's not true. Throughout history, ordinary people have fought against government abuse and won. The civil rights movement fought against COINTELPRO and won major victories. Anti-war activists exposed government lies about Vietnam. Journalists exposed Watergate and forced a president to resign. Change is possible, but it requires courage, persistence, and collective action. You're not powerless. You have a voice. You have a vote. You have the ability to organize, to protest, to demand change. The government has power, but in a democracy, the people have more power, if we choose to use it. These secret programs happened because the public was uninformed and disengaged. They ended because people fought back. The question is, what will you do? Will you forget about these programs and go back to trusting the government, or will you stay vigilant, stay informed, and demand accountability? The choice is yours. I want to end with a final thought about why I made this video. Some people might ask, why dig up the past? Why focus on these dark chapters of history? Why not focus on the positive things the government does? Here's why, because these aren't just historical curiosities. These programs reveal fundamental truths about power, secrecy, and government. They show us what happens when institutions operate without oversight. They show us what happens when national security is used to justify any abuse. They show us what happens when the public is kept in the dark, and most importantly, they show us that these abuses don't stop on their own. They only stop when people fight back. I made this video because I believe knowledge is power. The government's greatest weapon is secrecy. When people don't know what's being done in their name, they can't resist. But when people know the truth, when they understand the history, when they see the patterns, that's when change becomes possible. Every person who watches this video and learns about these programs is one more person who won't blindly trust government claims about national security. Every person who understands COINTELPRO will be more skeptical when the government targets activists. Every person who knows about NSA surveillance will be more protective of their privacy. Every person who learns about Operation Mockingbird will be more critical of media narratives. Knowledge is the first step toward resistance, but knowledge alone isn't enough. We also need to remember the victims, the people who were drugged in MKUltra experiments, the activists who were targeted by COINTELPRO, the black men who died in the Tuskegee study, concentration camp prisoners whose deaths enabled Operation Paperclip, the men who were drugged and filmed in Operation Midnight Climax. These weren't abstract victims. They were real people with families, dreams, and lives that were destroyed by government programs. We owe it to them to remember what happened. We owe it to them to make sure it doesn't happen again. And we owe it to future generations to create a government that respects rights, operates transparently, and can be held accountable. That's the America we should be fighting for, not the America that drugs its citizens, assassinates activists, and spies on everyone, but the America that actually lives up to its ideals of freedom, justice, and human dignity. Now, I know some of you are thinking, this is overwhelming. The government is too powerful. What difference can I make? I understand that feeling. When you learn about these programs, it's easy to feel powerless. But remember, every single one of these programs was exposed by individuals who decided to act. The MKUltra documents were found by a researcher who filed a Freedom of Information Act request. The COINTELPRO files were stolen by a small group of activists who broke into an FBI office. Edward Snowden was one person who decided that the truth was more important than his personal safety. One person can make a difference, but we're not just one person. We're millions of people who care about freedom and justice. Imagine if everyone who watches this video takes just one action. Contact one representative. Support one civil liberties organization. Share this information with one friend. That's millions of actions. That's a movement. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens through sustained pressure, through collective action, through people refusing to accept the status quo. The civil rights movement didn't win in a day. It took years of protests, organizing, and sacrifice. But they won. The anti-war movement didn't stop Vietnam immediately, but they exposed government lies and eventually forced an end to the war. Whistleblowers and journalists didn't reform the NSA overnight, but they exposed mass surveillance and forced some reforms. Progress is possible, but it requires all of us to participate. Here's what I want you to take away from this video. First, these programs actually happened. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is documented history. The government did these things. Second, the government will abuse power if given the opportunity. This isn't about Democrats or Republicans. This isn't about one administration or one agency. This is about the nature of power itself. Third, secrecy enables abuse. When programs operate in secret, without oversight, without accountability, abuse is inevitable. Fourth, vulnerable people are always targeted first, but eventually, the abuses expand to everyone. If you don't defend others, there will be no one to defend you. Fifth, nobody will hold the government accountable unless we demand it. The system doesn't reform itself. Change only happens through public pressure. Sixth, whistleblowers are essential to democracy. They risk everything to inform the public. We should protect them, not prosecute them. Seventh, knowledge is power. The more people who understand this history, the harder it becomes for the government to repeat it. And finally, you are not powerless. You have a voice, you have agency, you can make a difference. The government wants you to feel overwhelmed and powerless. They want you to think, there's nothing I can do. But that's a lie. You can do something. And when millions of people do something, everything changes. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and forget about it. Don't just feel outraged for a moment and then move on. Take action. Do something. Even if it's small. Share this video. Talk about these programs with your friends and family. File a Freedom of Information Act request. Contact your representative. Support a civil liberties organization. Protect your privacy. Think critically about the news. Defend vulnerable people. Do something. Because if we don't act, these programs will continue. The surveillance will expand. The secrecy will deepen. The abuses will multiply. But if we act, if we stay informed, stay vigilant and demand accountability, we can create a government that actually serves the people. We can create a government that respects rights instead of violating them. We can create a government that operates transparently instead of in secret. We can create a government that fears the people instead of the other way around. That's the America worth fighting for. The programs I've described in this video are dark and disturbing. They reveal the worst aspects of government power, but they also reveal something hopeful. These programs were exposed. People fought back. Some reforms were achieved. It's not enough, but it proves that resistance is possible. The government is powerful, but the people are more powerful if we choose to use that power. So use it. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. Stay engaged. Question authority. Demand transparency. Hold officials accountable, support whistleblowers, protect the vulnerable, defend civil liberties, and never, ever blindly trust the government when they say, this is for your safety. Because we've seen what they do when we trust them. They drug us, they spy on us, they lie to us, they experiment on us. They do it in secret. They do it without accountability, and they do it in the name of protecting us. But we don't need that kind of protection. We need a government that respects our rights, tells us the truth, and can be held accountable. And the only way we get that government is if we demand it. So demand it, fight for it. Because the alternative is to accept a government that operates in secret, abuses its power, and treats citizens as subjects to be controlled rather than people to be served. And that's not acceptable. We deserve better. Our children deserve better. Future generations deserve better. So let's create better. Let's create a government worthy of a free people. Let's create a democracy that actually works. Let's create an America that lives up to its ideals. It won't be easy. It will take time, effort, and courage, but it's possible. It starts with you. It starts with watching this video and deciding that you won't forget. It starts with learning the truth and refusing to be lied to. It starts with one person deciding to act, and then another, until millions of people are acting together. That's how change happens. That's how we win. So here's my final message. Remember these programs. Remember what the government did. Remember the victims. Remember the whistleblowers who exposed the truth. And then act. Do something to make sure this never happens again. Because if we don't, it will. The choice is ours. Long pause. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough to spend 2 hours learning about these programs. Now go do something about it. The future of democracy depends on it.